As we've learned throughout the semester and in our daily lives, the world has become increasingly dependent on computer information systems. But surely the vulnerabilities we've learned in class have been patched by now, right? Not so much. In fact, the open issues in cybersecurity are growing faster than we can patch them. Cybersecurity Ventures predicts cybercrime damages will cost the world $6 trillion annually by the end of this year. My name is Seth Phillips, and I'm joined by Noah Tongate, Nathan Domagolski, Jackson Paul, Megan Mihaljevic, Shane Evans, and Jared Blagum. Today, we're going to tell you about attack vectors, mitigation techniques, malware detection, encryption, and vulnerability assessments. This is Modern Malware.
There are about 8 general types of attack vectors. For example, compromised credentials, weak and or stolen credentials, malicious insiders, missing or poor encryption, misconfiguration, ransomware, phishing, or maybe even social engineering, and trust relationships. The username and password is one of the most common types of access credentials. A compromised credentials is when the username and password are exposed to an unauthorized entity. This usually happens when someone falls prey to some kind of phishing attempt or has a copy of their clear text passwords on a file on their computer or in a sticky note on their desk. This attack vector usually poses a threat because it allows the attacker to effectively bypass perimeter security, and this can pose a great threat if the attacker manages to get a hold of a privileged account credentials. And this can be dangerous because it allows the attacker to possibly pivot around the network to other computers, servers, or maybe even network devices. A weak or stolen password will constitute for things such as the reuse of passwords across the network devices or credentials that are easy to crack and not that really long and complex. Apps or protocols that may be sending credentials over the network unencrypted can be sniffed with a traffic logger such as Wireshark. An attacker could steal Active Directory credentials that are being used across the network. This would also allow the attacker to propagate across the network. There are different types of insider threats, such as a compromised user that can be because maybe they had weak or stolen or even compromised credentials. A careless user may even leave their terminal or computer unlocked and either clock out for the workday or even walk away from their desk. This can be great for when a malicious user or malicious insider can just walk right up and take control of the computer and type in whatever they want to gain access. Finally, the third type of insider threat would be a malicious user, which can be someone that maybe already have an account compromised and may willfully extract data and intellectual property from the company network. Another attack vector that can possibly lead to compromise is not using encryption or just using poor encryption. The general idea of encryption is to protect the digital data confidentiality, to use strong encryption when the data is at rest, in motion, and where it is suitable, and things such as when it's being processed. Another attack vector is misconfiguration. That is when there is an error or mistake made in the system configuration or service that is running. For example, if you set up a website that is being used for e-commerce and the default password is still being used, this can be considered as a misconfiguration. Another great example to add on to that is that maybe when you set up the e-commerce page, the install folder is still accessible and it will allow the attacker to reset the page and the whole entire setup process. 64% of misconfigurations is just made from human error. Ransomware is a form of cyber extortion where the user's data is held ransom until the ransom is paid. Usually the ransomware explains what it is and how to recover your files and even how to pay the ransom.
In 2013, the CryptoLocker ransomware attack was carried out. Having come from a botnet named Zeus, servers, or individuals' machines, also called slaves in this context, were collected in silence in this botnet. This virus propagated originally through infected email attachments. When activated, the malware encrypted certain types of files stored on local and mounted network drives using RSA public key cryptography, with the private key stored only on the malware's control servers. The program required Bitcoin, or a prepaid card, to be transferred to a remote wallet such that the client could take full advantage of monetary gain. This could be easily bypassed with a simple system restore. For those that did not have backups, this was a major issue. It was reported that even if the fine was paid, you could not quite guarantee that all of the files would be unencrypted. Due to the length of the key employed by CryptoLocker, experts considered it practically impossible to use a brute force attack to obtain the key needed to decrypt files without paying ransom, leaving minimal possible mitigation techniques besides carefulness and creating backups to restore from. Even more sinister, in the summer of 2016, a group by the name of the Shadow Brokers appeared out of nowhere and confidently boasted about a special deal going on, a bidding war for tools, exploits, and malware utilized by the NSA. Of course, no one believed them, and no one would pay enough Bitcoin to tickle their fancy to begin with. Because of the large amount of skepticism from the community and the Shadow Brokers' limited credibility, they would then release the Eternal Blue exploit. Eternal Blue contains kernel shellcode to load the non-persistent double pulsar backdoor, a backdoor on Windows machines implemented by the NSA. Following the leak of this tool, the WannaCry ransomware virus was born and was spreading, infecting, and bricking machines faster than any virus ever had. Within 4 days, the numbers of infected machines jumped to a couple 100,000 and continued to increase. When executed, the WannaCry first checks a, quote, kill switch domain name, intelligently implemented by the original programmers. If this is not found, then the ransomware encrypts the computer's data, then attempts to exploit the SMB vulnerability to spread out to random computers on the internet, and laterally to computers on the same network. As with other modern ransomware, the payload displays a message informing the user that the files have been encrypted and demands a payment of around $300 in Bitcoin within 3 days. Because of the kill switch, this dangerous ransomware would eventually become mitigated. Though it begs the question still, what if there was no kill switch to begin with?
Phishing is one of the most common social engineering attack vectors out there. Phishing is where someone sends you a fake email asking you to provide some kind of information or maybe even just to send them money. And you might have actually got some of this kind of emails in your spam folder from like a Nigerian prince asking you to send them money or maybe even directing you to a fake account to provide their login credentials. Although nowadays, a lot of phishing attempts are much harder to get to the end user because of filtering and being able to check the credibility of the sender.
Today, the most common form of phishing and social engineering techniques involves telemarketing Windows support scams. Cold call scam callers have occurred as early as the early 2000s and have been occurring more often recently. With the integration of technology and the personal computer into society, those of all ages and backgrounds in Western society are expected to have access to computers. Some take advantage of the naive nature of those without necessary skepticism or knowledge to distinguish falsehood from reality. Some websites will redirect you to a low-budget HTML web page with a JavaScript pop-up script injected into it that orders you to call a number to, quote, fix your machine, providing you a phone number conveniently to call, quote, Microsoft Tech Support. Typically, once on the phone, the Microsoft Tech Support scammer will attempt to coerce the scamee with tricks of confidence and social engineering. Remote access programs are essential. TeamViewer, LogMeIn, and AnyDesk are among the most popular. Once access is gained, the scammer will again build the trust by a number of different techniques. These tricks are meant to fool those without knowledge of the Windows system and convince them that they are who they say they are. What will typically happen from here on out is the scammer will request payment information, addresses, names, etc. of the individuals to issue a purchase for a, quote, antivirus program, or simply for their services to clean up their device. If the amount is not paid, they will continue to argue and become increasingly frustrated, essentially enforcing ransomware-esque techniques. The best mitigation is to gain knowledge on the subject. Become skeptical and do not trust everything you see on the internet.
Trust relationships are more commonly seen in enterprise computer environments. Computers or domain controllers can allow trust between users or other systems. Trust relations are usually used to connect two computers or more domains to allow users to authenticate over a large domain or even just the computer assets itself. An attacker can abuse this by gaining access to the computer that has a trust with another domain or computer and can use this access to move laterally across the network to another computer or possibly an entire new domain.
So now that we learned about possible attack vectors, how do we go about mitigating these attacks? Well, first for credentials, it's about avoiding common usernames and passwords. If you just use admin password or admin, this is a common admin login credential for a web page and is usually one of the first guesses people will make. This is also about using different passwords for different services. Even if you memorize a very complex password but use it everywhere, if a breach were to happen, then an attacker could get into the website as they already know that password. As a last line of defense, you should also be using multi-factor authentication where possible, especially on important websites that you use. This is so that if an attacker were to get your username and password for a website, they would still need that last line of authentication that would be a randomly generated series of digits. And when you're generating your passwords, it's about using good password hygiene. This is basically having upper lowercase, numbers, special symbols, and certain length requirements. For phishing, you want to be monitoring web browsing and email link clicks in an enterprise network. If a user were to accidentally click one of these links and maybe expose themselves, we want to be proactively aware and be able to reach out to the user before something bad were to happen. And some of these ways that you can be proactive is allowing an easy reporting button, so that way if a user were to receive one and be aware that this is a phishing scam, you can alert the security team. And then auto-flagging common things that would be for phishing emails rather than legitimate emails. On encryption, you want to ensure sensitive data is encrypted at all points. This is whether it's stationary or at rest, in transit, or arriving at the destination. And when you're using this encryption, you want to make sure that you're using a good level of encryption that meets good security requirements and isn't just at a compliance level. For possible misconfigured applications, you want to use automatic procedures where you can. This would be if somebody opens up a port on a box that shouldn't be open, auto-closing that port for the user. This is also having clear and concise procedures that a user can easily understand when making their application or setting up a box, so that way everything is up to a certain standard. And then lastly, it's monitoring these applications and devices for in the event that they may become misconfigured and reporting on that misconfiguration. Continuing on, we have also ransomware attacks. To mitigate these, you mainly want to look at monitoring your devices using least privilege access and keeping system up to date. So for monitoring devices, you want to make sure that if a device were to be affected by a ransomware attack, that you can isolate it from the network and not let it propagate any further. And you also want to use least privilege access so that way a user can't accidentally install this in the first place, and then keep the systems up to date. When dealing with malicious insiders, you want to look at an employee's network activity and the data that they are accessing and sending out. And then with trust relationships, you want to limit this as much as possible, so that way a user in one network can't just access everything in another network being signed in only one place. And going back to the passwords, having different passwords for different areas, so that way an attacker with a password for a user can't just pivot through multiple networks and get access to everything. Lastly, we have security end layers. The goal of this is to restrict apps and devices where possible within a network. So your first line defense for traffic coming in or going out is going to be your firewall. This is so that only whitelisted traffic can come in from the outside and you can only access things outside the network that you have allowed. Firewalls can range in possibilities from being a simple allow all going out, nothing coming in, to very complex, being able to scan up to the application level. Then you have switches, and generally you want to use layer 3 switches in the security and layer environment, and these switches allow you to whitelist traffic between subnets or even between intra-subnet communication, so that way in a user level network, two users can't really talk to each other at all. It would be isolated if something were to happen to one of them. And then lastly, you have endpoint protection. And the goal here is that you can auto stop things from running and basically pick up on any viruses that a user might have accidentally downloaded and alert to the security team.
There are many ways to detect malware, and here are a few of them. There is signature-based detection. The pros of this is that it finds malware signatures within a system that are already identified, and it's easy to detect most traditional forms of malware. Unfortunately, it is unable to detect malware with code changes and hard to find other new-gen malware. Sandboxing is used to test code and applications within a sandbox environment to see how they react. However, malware can be created to be sandbox aware, which causes them to behave differently in that environment. Next, there is heuristic analysis, which examines system behavior to find threats, and it's able to find threats outside of the normal use of the system. It's able to detect polymorphic malware, and upon detecting malware, it doesn't send any of the details to malware developers. However, it cannot detect heavily obfuscated malware, and it is still best for traditional malware over new-gen. Next, there's endpoint malware detection. This monitors, logs, and analyzes data to look for malware activity. There's also application whitelisting, which gives more control over a system than blacklisting, and it's used in high-risk environments such as ATMs and other banking information. There are many different tools that can be used to detect and remove malware on different systems. One of these is Malwarebytes. This is an anti-malware software made for many different operating systems. It scans files in batch mode instead of all open files for quicker discovery of malware, and this was released in 2006. Next is McAfee Virus Scan. This is part of a larger group of products from McAfee. It is known to have a lot of issues with it, and their customer service is known to not be the best either. And this was released in 1988. Finally, there's Norton Antivirus, which uses signature-based detection as well as heuristics to detect malware. They also have a first line of defense in the form of email and spam filters to prevent phishing emails from coming across. And this was released in 1991. There are many cases of malware appearing as legitimate software. In January 2020, Windows 10 had a flaw large enough that it was made known to the public to install the patch updates immediately. This allowed malware to hide as legitimate software and be installed on Windows 10. In October 2020, Emotet was hiding as a Trojan and was displaying to users as Windows Update, and upon installing that Windows Update, it would install the malware instead. And finally, in April and May of 2019, ransomware Dharma was hiding as a fake antivirus software. They would use phishing emails in order to push users to update their antivirus software, and instead it would install the ransomware on the computer.
Noah and Jackson talked about encryption earlier, but I will reiterate a few points here. So once again, what is encryption? Encryption is the process of taking plain text such as a text message or email and scrambling it into an unreadable format called ciphertext. This helps protect the confidentiality of digital data either stored in computer systems or transmitted through a network like the internet. To get the original message back from the ciphertext, a decryption is used. There are two types of encryption, symmetric and asymmetric. Symmetric encryption uses a single public key shared between the source and destination to transmit data. As you can see from the picture on the right, the message is encrypted into ciphertext and decrypted to the original message with the same key. Asymmetric encryption is a little more sophisticated because it utilizes two keys, one public key to encrypt the message at the source and one private key to decrypt the ciphertext at the destination. As said before, encryption can be used to securely protect data on your machine, as well as information and messages transmitted over the internet, but encryption can also be used for malicious purposes. Malware can utilize encryption to stay hidden on a user's machine for long periods of time, where it can sneakily infect files while also being able to send wanted data back to an attacker. Malware that works like this can be categorized as an advanced persistent threat, or APT for short. An APT uses polymorphic malware with encryption. Polymorphic malware replicates itself and changes certain attributes every time it infects another program. In this case, the encryption keys could be changed every time, meaning each infected program has a unique key for encryption and decryption. Overall, this will cause most antivirus systems to not be able to detect this kind of malware. This just shows how powerful encryption can be to hide malware. Advanced persistent threat malware can be hidden in memory. Without touching the hard drive, the malware can execute in memory and inject itself into processes and store encrypted payloads inside of image files to avoid detection. Encryption is also used when sending data back to attackers over a transport security layer or TLS connection. So what is the transport security layer? The transport security layer is a widely adopted security protocol designed to facilitate privacy and data security for communications over the internet. TLS uses a combination of symmetric and asymmetric encryption to transmit data securely, which means it is an almost perfect way for an attacker to transmit victim data back to their machine. To use TLS, attackers usually communicate using port 443, which is the standard port used for TLS encrypted HTTPS communications. Malware is increasingly going towards using a TLS connection. In a study by Sophos Labs, they found that 23% of malware that made an internet connection used TLS to communicate, and nearly half of malware that steals information uses TLS to send it back to an attacker. A packer program is software that compresses files and then unpacks itself when a program or file is ready to be executed. The process of packer compression or encryption takes the file from its original code to a new state using obfuscation techniques. The original use of this was to compress files, but now is used largely to encrypt and hide malware to allow it to stay in systems undetected by antivirus software. It's important to note that packers are not inherently malicious, but can be used to make malicious software harder to detect. Some of the most common packers used to encrypt malware are VM Protect, XE Stealth, and Morphine. vmprotect is a popular packer that can encrypt a variety of files types such as executables, drivers, and dynamic link libraries or DLL files. XE-Stealth is a free packer software designed by Web Toolmasters and one of the best anti-hacking tools, which ironically also makes it effective at hiding malware code in the system. Morphine is unique in that it includes its own portable executable loader, which allows users to encrypt the output of compressed data. Attackers can also utilize Morphine's polymorphic techniques to create unique decryptors for their malware. There aren't a shortage of packer programs on the internet, and they are very commonly utilized to hide malware, so it's important to be able to identify files that have been modified by a packer. Luckily, there are numerous amounts of packer detecting tools such as Windows Executable Packer Detection, Packer ID, and PEID that can accomplish this. Another use for encryption in malware is the ability to lock users out. This can specifically be seen in ransomware, which has been discussed quite a bit already. By using a combination, the malware utilizes symmetric encryption for high performance, while also using asymmetric encryption to decrypt with one private key. So this begs the question, can encrypted files be decrypted without paying the ransom? Answer is yes, but realistically it depends on how thorough the ransomware creator was. For example, files could be decrypted if a weak encryption algorithm were used or if the keys can be found inside the malware code, but this becomes more and more unlikely as ransomware evolves and gets more sophisticated over time.
Penetration testing has sometimes been confused with vulnerability assessment. Vulnerability assessments, also known as vulnerability scans, are scans of a software build that look for known vulnerabilities and report potential exposures. For example, NPM's audit feature. Network assessments are the more commonly run type of vulnerability assessment. It determines what services are available on the network and analyzes those services for potential vulnerabilities. The other type of assessment, host assessments, are run on specific devices to find system-level vulnerabilities like a Trojan. At the most surface level, what is the difference between a penetration test and a vulnerability assessment? Actually trying to hack into the system. Like an actual hack, penetration tests attempt to break into the system and find anything some bad actor would want to steal, be it passwords or credit card numbers, etc. Vulnerability assessments are only trying to find the access points. Penetration tests are authorized attacks to evaluate the security of the system and the data that it protects. Vulnerability assessments are scans of a program or network against a list of known vulnerabilities. Penetration tests report on what data can be leaked from your programs, while vulnerability assessments report on what vulnerabilities there are to exploit. Penetration tests will use new, exploitable vulnerabilities to see what they can access unauthorized and report on what vulnerabilities led anywhere and what didn't, while vulnerability assessments report on known, by the broader security community, and new vulnerabilities that have been detected and recorded since. Penetration tests provide a preventative measure against data exposure by simulating a hack, while vulnerability assessments detect when something has a known security flaw with a solution that can be patched automatically. Penetration tests are run against the system as any outsider would have access to it, while vulnerability assessments are run with insider information, a full build of the system assessing the entire source code. The thematic difference is depth versus breadth. A penetration test is going to try and dig deep into any singular vulnerability it finds, while a vulnerability assessment is going to try and find as many vulnerabilities as it can, without really touching on what it can dig into. Neither is a bad approach, and both should be done in order to better secure systems.
Remote administration tools are one of the prime examples of how the use of tools can determine the ethicality. That is, remote administration tools have many positive purposes. Remote access to a computer allows IT employees working remotely to troubleshoot and fix issues without having to have direct physical access to a device. Though, along with these practical applications, comes a darker side of the spectrum. Utilizing remote administration tools as a method of gaining unauthorized access is a common practice in the realm of modern malware, and is what Trojan viruses typically are. Many examples of these programs today include Dark Comet, which the Syrian government used as surveillance against its people during a civil war, Quasar Rat, which is an open source rat hosted on GitHub that is still in development today, and Blackshades, among many others. Blackshade specifically would result in its creator, as well as nearly 100 other individuals, being arrested in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, following many banking corporations being infected with the rat. Today, many of these rats by themselves are picked up by antivirus programs, though There do exist obfuscation programs that will obfuscate or encrypt the binary of the executable, masking its malicious behavior.
Today we've talked a lot about malware. Despite the scary growth, capabilities, and experience that malware creators have, the general consensus is that there are methods of prevention so long as we stay sharp between the ears. Malice and ignorance will always exist, so malware will be ever present. Our leaders need to consider all these things as we expand into new technologies over the coming years. In the meantime, stay secure.